Did you commit to another CPA review course that just isn't aligned with how you learn? Well, spilled milk, baby. In the world of accounting, only one figure matters, and that's the bottom line. So by investing in Universal CPA Review, you're investing in yourself, and we promise to do everything in our power to get you the ROI that you're looking for by obtaining your CPA license. We know that purchasing a CPA review course is an investment, and we also know that spending all that money on a program that hasn't worked out sucks, and we want to soften that blow. Our Spilled Milk program will allow you to commit to Universal's Visual Learning CPA Review program at a steep discount. So reach out to info@universalcpareview.com to learn more about our program and what discounts you qualify for. All right, the next document that we need to draw our attention to is the Audit Documentation, also known as the Audit Workpapers, sometimes referred to as the Working Papers. And as we mentioned previously, when you think about the context of these documents, if you're trying to memorize, it's going to be very easy to confuse what is included in the audit documentation versus information that is included in the terms of the engagement, right? That engagement letter, and the context that is included in the management representation letter. Okay, so point being is I can't stress this enough. We can't memorize our way through the audit exam. We have to understand the intuition behind it, and we need to break out the key differences in each of these respective topics. So what's key for you to understand is that this is our documentation for what we have uncovered as the auditors about the client. This is what we wrote down throughout the engagement. So to even simplify further, this is what we wrote down as sort of our comprehensive notes that now belong to us. So keep in mind, this is not management's work papers or management's source documentation. All right, so I'll say it again. This does not belong to management. This is our documentation as the auditors. And while yes, this documentation is what we're writing down about management, it is still our work papers. So at the end of the day, when it comes to putting together the audit report and ultimately coming to an audit opinion, think of this as providing us with a basis for putting together that report and that opinion. So at the highest of levels, think of this as the drafted information, right? Think of this as the outline for what the report is based off of. Okay, and it's also going to provide supporting evidence that the audit was conducted in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards, right? So if anybody tries to give Detective Lucy any crap for not following generally accepted auditing standards, she could come back and say, but I did though. Just take a look at our audit documentation. Okay, so what do you need to know for the exam related to audit documentation? Well, just like the engagement letter, there's a lot of context that you should know. There's a lot of words that go into these audit documents. So the audit exam is very wordy. We know that by now. So we're going to break this out into a digestible format, and we're going to build that mental map. Okay, so to break this out in its simplest of forms, the high-level questions that you need to be able to answer related to audit documentation consist of the what, the where, and the for how long. Does that sound oversimplified to you? Good, it should, because we're not studying to become brain surgeons here, okay? We're not trying to be rocket scientists. While this is challenging and we do need to pay attention, this is doable, so let's go through it. Okay, so the first question we need to ask ourselves in our mental map is the what. And more specifically, we want to know what are the required items that should be documented by the auditor. Okay, we should also have a general idea for the amount of documentation that the auditor should compile. And while the amount of audit documentation is based on the auditor's professional judgment, right? Detective Lucy can sort of decide what's a reasonable amount that should be documented. That's all going to be based on the overall nature of the audit procedures that she is doing and writing down in those work papers. Right? If she had to do a ton of tests for the client's inventory balance, then the amount that is going to be documented is obviously going to be more. It can also have to do with the size and complexity of the client. Right? If Max at Accrual World is a massive multinational organization, or maybe the company has a ton of complicated transactions or derivatives in its statement of stockholders' equity, well, then again, a Detective Lucy is probably going to have to do more work and more documenting would be necessary. Okay, so the amount of documentation can also have to do with the significance of the evidence that was obtained. All right, so those are a few factors that can impact the amount of documentation that should be collected. All right, but keep in mind, this is not the entire list. This is just a few of the items at a high level. All right, so going back to the question at hand, the what. We want to know what is required to be documented. Right, first question in our mental map. Okay, so I'm not going to lie to you, this is a massive list. And while I can sit here and tell you that you should memorize every single bullet point that might or might not be documented, or even what's fair game on the exam, That's not going to be the best way for you to think about this. All right, so as always, let's understand the intuition behind it. So we're going to think about the buzzwords that you need to be on the lookout for related to audit documentation. Okay, so our first buzzwords related to audit documentation are going to consist of assisting the audit team and audit reviewers. Right, the whole point of this, which by the way has been asked on the exam, is to provide another auditor. Could be a quality reviewer, which could be one of Detective Lucy's friends over at Palmer CPA firm, or it could be a peer reviewer or even a successor auditor. But more importantly, any auditor who ultimately has zero affiliation with this client should be able to use the audit documentation to provide them with enough information so that they can better understand and ultimately start auditing the client themselves. Right? This is essentially a roadmap for other auditors. Okay, so any answer choice that seems like it's assisting the audit team and audit reviewers is going to be a safe bet to be included in audit documentation. Okay, so some commonly tested items that you can see. This can include assisting the audit team to plan and perform the audit. It can include assisting auditors who are new to the audit engagement and review the prior year's documentation to understand work performed as an aid in planning and performing the current engagement. In other words, this should allow successor auditors to take over our work and pick up where we left off. Assisting members of the audit team responsible for supervision to direct and supervise the audit work and to review the quality of the work performed. Assisting quality control reviewers, right? We remember what quality control reviewers are. This is Dave, our friend within our CPA firm, right? Palmer CPA firm. Okay, so this is going to allow them to review documentation and understand how the engagement team reached a significant conclusion and whether there is adequate evidential support for those conclusions. Okay, and our next buzzword is going to be something significant, right? So anytime you see significant factors such as fraud risk factors, that's going to fall within the what. That is something that should be documented. All right, so we're going to record significant matters discovered during the audit. Could also be significant findings or issues involved in the selection, application, and consistency of accounting principles with regard to the financial statements. Okay, so including related disclosures. This could include things like complex or unusual transactions or estimates and uncertainties. All right, and really anything else that seems important from performing the audit. Okay, so as far as buzzwords go, this one's a little bit vague, but basically we're just saying focus on anything miscellaneous that if you feel like is something that would be helpful related to this client that the auditor discovered when conducting the engagement, right? Something that you would write down. So some additional information that should be documented can be findings that could result in a modification. All right, other audit adjustments like the correction of a misstatement of the financial information that is identified by the auditor. Okay, so anything that is pertinent to the audit engagement. All right, so going through a quick summary of why audit documentation is needed. It should be used to help plan and perform the audit. It should be used to assist new audit team members and quality reviewers. It should be used to document the procedures that we, the auditors, have performed and the conclusions that we, the auditors, have reached. Alrighty, next question. Question number 2 is the where. So this is specifically asking for where audit documentation needs to be retained. Okay, so there are 2 important files that you need to understand for the exam. We need to understand information that is going to be retained in the current file and information that is going to be retained in the permanent file. What information is going into which file? Okay, so again, you might be tempted to memorize certain documents that are going to be retained in each respective file, but that's no way to learn. So let's understand what the point of these files are. The current file is meant to hold audit documentation from the engagement from the current year only. Okay, so this is current year information. So literally thinking about this file sitting over at Palmer CPA firm where Detective Lucy works and is ultimately going about her business. She's performing all of these procedures when auditing Accrual World. This is the documentation from this year's audit of the client. Okay, so she's literally writing all this stuff down, which we know is considered her documentation, right? This is the auditor's documentation. And any information from this documentation related to the current year is once again going into the current file. Okay, so we got to know current year information. Okay, so what are some examples of current year information? Well, this includes the current year financial statements. right? Could be Accrual World's income statement, statement of cash flows, balance sheet for this year. This can also include their trial balance, their adjusting journal entries from this year. Okay, so anything that sounds like current year financial information should be held in the current file. All right, so it could be this year's audit report. So if Detective Lucy came to an unmodified opinion this year, that report would be retained in this year's current file. Okay, so any significant findings would go in the current file. Why? Because it's related to this year's audit. All right, and again, audit procedures related to this year's audit, all going to be reported in the current file. And this is different from the permanent file in that the permanent file is going to more broadly hold information about the client over the course of its existence. So basically, this is information related to the client that never changes. It is a continuing interest every single year. All right, so examples could be pension plans. If Accrual World starts a pension plan for its employees, and that plan has been incorporated in year one, well, that means that any prior service costs related to the pension will always be as of this date. Same goes for stock options. When stock options have been granted, they will always have been granted as of this date, right? Never going to change. Contracts are set in stone. So if this is a 5-year contract, this is information that is never changing. Okay, so more importantly, the contract that we'd be looking at when we're auditing the client is not specific to this current year under audit. Okay, so other specific contracts like leases and loan agreements, these are also going to be examples of information that is never changing. So they would go in the permanent file as well. Articles of incorporation. Obviously, information is never changing if the company is an LLC that was incorporated in the state of Virginia 6 years ago. So it will have always been incorporated 6 years ago in the state of Virginia. That information is never changing. That's why it's going in the permanent file. So again, people, we can't memorize this stuff. We need to understand the why. And hopefully now you understand why certain documents are going in the current file versus the permanent file. Okay, this has to be easy points on the exam. All right, and third major question is the for how long. And this is actually going to be broken up into two related questions. Okay, so we want to know how long are we going to hold on to the audit documentation, and we also want to know how long do we have to complete our documentation. Right after we have obtained evidence and we are ready to release our audit report, how long do we subsequently have to go ahead and wrap up and finalize that documentation? Okay, so let's first address question number 1. How long should the auditor retain the documentation? Right, Detective Lucy diligently put together her audit documentation. She has her work papers. She stored them in the current file, and she did that for information related to the current year audit. All right, she also stored more permanent information in the permanent file. So now we're asking, how long does she need to hold on to that current file and that permanent file? Okay, so think of these as two separate folders. How long does she need to hold on to these folders? And it depends on whether this is a non-issuer that we audited or an issuer that we audited, right? Did we audit Galbraith Dental Clinic or did we audit Boobaloo Inc.? Okay, so when thinking about this, be mindful of the fact that professional standards would be more strict on requirements for auditing issuers. Okay, and you can remember that because maybe more financial statement readers are relying on financial statements prepared by issuers, right? We have the general public at risk here, so stricter rules. So intuitively, that would mean that documentation related to audits of issuers should be held for longer periods of time. All right, so in case we need to readdress what the auditor did, we want to have a few extra years to go back and look at this information. Okay, so audit documentation related to issuers should be held for 7 years, whereas documentation related to non-issuers should be held for 5 years. Gotta remember those. And if you get tripped up and you're thinking, wait, I remember that it's 5 years for 7 years, but I can't remember which is which. Always remember stricter rules for issuers. Therefore, they have to hold on to these work papers for a longer period of time. Okay, so addressing part 2 of question number 3, which is how long do we have to wrap up the audit documentation? Okay, so again, stricter rules for issuers, meaning professional standards say that if you audited an issuer, your audit documentation should be wrapped up and completed in a faster period of time. Okay, so audit documentation related to the client, if it's an issuer, should be completed within a 45-day period. And that's going to be after the audit report release date. And audit documentation for non-issuers should be wrapped up and completed within 60 days from the audit report release date. Okay, so what is the audit report release date? Well, the audit report release date for non-issuers will be the date in which sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. So if sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained as of November 1st, even though the balance sheet date isn't until December 31st, then our audit documentation should be wrapped up within 60 days from November 1st, right? Whereas if we're auditing Boobaloo Inc., an issuer, then the audit report release date means something a little bit different. That's the date in which the audit report is released to financial statement readers, and no new evidence is obtained, only enhanced. So basically, let's say we're auditing Boobaloo Inc., and the client has a December 31st year-end balance sheet date, but we haven't released this report to financial statement readers until February 12th. Well, then the audit documentation doesn't need to be wrapped up and completed until 45 days after February 12th. Okay, so that's much more detail than you're likely going to need to understand for the exam. With that being said, you might see a complicated task-based simulation that requires that you really break this down, all right? But the most important takeaway is the total days that are going to be required for non-issuers versus issuers. And we got to remember stricter rules for issuers, okay? So issuers will have 45 days to wrap it up. Non-issuers will have 60 days. How long do they need to hold on to the work papers? Non-issuers will have 5 years. Issuers must hold on to it for 7 years. All right, so don't overcomplicate this stuff. We got to remember our mental map. We got to remember our 3 main questions. All right, the what, we got to remember the where, and we got to remember the for how long.